Yes, this video is going to be a bit different to anything else I've uploaded on this channel so far. Since this is all about how I made most of the videos I uploaded and will upload in the future, except maybe the first video, which was made a bit different. Generally, I have 4 steps in making these videos. First, recording, where I record all my voice lines. Second, drawing, where I create my own 16:9 comic panels. After that, cutting, where I add all of the sound effects to the already recorded voice lines. And lastly, the animation, where I animate all the comic panels to match the audio comic. By the way, I also do perform them in this exact order most of the time, but for longer videos, like the main chapters, I often go through all the steps on one part of the chapter before continuing with the next part. That is simply to keep the process more fun and not too repetitive. So let's start with the first step, recording. As I already write in all my descriptions, I'm terrible at reading and also haven't done any voice work before this project. The result is that there are a lot of bad takes produced during this step. Sometimes I do however also record multiple versions on purpose, so I can later decide which one works better in context of the scene. After I've then recorded all the lines, which can result in quite a lot of recordings, I go through all the recorded audio from beginning to end and cut out all the false attempts. Often this is as easy as simply keeping the last version of the line I recorded, since that was the one I was most satisfied with at the time of recording as well. Give me that! Give me that! Give me that! Give me that! But other times I made multiple takes of the same line that simply differ in delivery, in which case I need to decide on the best delivery for that line in context of the story. The best way to do that, I found, is by process of elimination. So I hear through all the versions and pick the one that I like least, delete that one and repeat the process until the best delivery is found. Hi, 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 hi. Sometimes I have however 2 versions that both have superior takes in different parts of the delivered line. In this case, I will first try to combine both in a way that will not be noticed in the final product. And I still like you the still like you still like you and I still like you the most and I still like you and I still like and I still like you the most. If that is not successful, I mark both clips to be re-recorded. Lastly, I also use some coloring to highlight the use of different recordings. For example, brown recordings mean that they were background sounds that weren't actually part of the lines in the comic. This can be sounds like laughter or a surprise sound. I also use the same color system to highlight clips for re-recording, by using different strengths of orange highlighting how important a re-recording of this recording is. In the end, I redo parts of this step by doing re-recordings of all the lines I had no usable recordings of, and after that, I can move on to the next step. Now we already come to one of the most complex parts of these audio comics, which probably isn't even noticeable to the people only watching the end product: drawing. This step starts by dragging the needed pages into my image program, Pixelmator, and removing the background. Then I start cutting that page into separate panels, which I can later rearrange and animate. Usually my 16:9 panels contain 2, sometimes 2.5 original comic pages, though there are also special occasions where I use less or more pages for a single 16:9 panel. Now we get to the more complicated parts and the reason why this takes such a long time. One possibility that can occur is that a later shown panel overlaps with the current panel, like in this case the idea panel with the one where Nick and Charlie are fighting over the laptop. So, to first show the fighting panel and only after that the idea panel, the only way to make this possible without showing an incomplete panel is by expanding the original panel drawn by Alice Oseman. When doing this, I try to make extensive use of the already existing elements, like the border of the panels, because I unfortunately don't have access to the same brushes as Alice Oseman in my software, and can therefore not replicate the same style as well. This is probably also the moment to talk about the fact that I'm not an artist at all. I didn't even take art classes all the way through school. So a lot of this probably takes way more time than it should, but I do think a lot of the results are at least passable. It probably also doesn't help that I'm only using a MacBook trackpad for drawing and not the actual proper hardware. Next, I need to cut out all the decorations, hearts, flowers, and especially for the main comic, often the iconic leaves. After they are also on their separate layers to be animated, I put them into appropriate groups. Then it is time to rearrange all the separate panels and decorations to work well in the 16:9 aspect ratio I use for my videos. Now we get to the other really hard step, removing the speech bubbles from the panels and creating a separate layer for them, so I can only display them once the line in them is actually spoken. This is specifically done for panels with more than one speech bubble. For this to work, however, I often need to recreate what should be behind the speech bubble on the panel, which uses a similar process to how I expanded the panels. In this specific example, we can however also see more clearly how I use replication, blending, and whenever possible the Pixelmator repair tool to recreate the textures of Alice Oseman's original panels as best as possible. This other example shows the second challenge with removing speech bubbles, as oftentimes there are objects behind these speech bubbles that need to be recreated as faithfully as possible to the Heartstopper design. The same now also needs to be done to all the visual sound effects, like in this example the no laptop sound effect. For this, it is often a lot easier to fill in the panels however, and using the Pixelmator repair tool often gets the job done. Lastly, I would also need to add paint to the background in some scenes that require it. Unfortunately, I don't have an example of that here, as background paint was not required for the Boy Band Crush mini-comic. This is also true of my effort to change a few panels' appearance to integrate them more into the end result, which was also not needed for Boy Band Crush but is used in several panels, especially to highlight important ones. Now we can continue with cutting, which I prefer to do after creating my own panels, because then I have a better idea of which parts of the comics will be animated and therefore need special sound effects. For cutting, I add sound effects scene by scene most of the time. This also includes final pacing of the voice lines. For the purposes of this video, I thought I will explain the process through the creation of a single small scene. What are you doing? Nothing? So, to start I need to search for the needed sound effects in my sound library, which I extend constantly with new sounds whenever I can't find the sound I need. This in and of itself takes a considerable amount of time, especially because I need to switch up sound effects often so that nothing gets too repetitive. After I finally found the perfect sound effect, I now need to tweak it. Almost every single one, for example, is tweaked in volume to fit the scene. Some, however, are also tweaked further after that, for example through a simple equalizer. In this example, I wanted the laptop slam to be less heavy in the highs and to have a bit more bass. Something I again didn't use in Boy Band Crush, but do use in other audio comics, are environmental based effects, like for example the reverb in a bathroom. If effects like these were needed, I would add them now. Then I pan the sound effect to the left or right to match the scene. In this case, the laptop is close by Charlie, who is located left on Nick's bed. So I pan the sound effect slightly to the left. Now I add one of the most common sound effects to a scene, the whip effect. This one is used in a wide variety of situations as it is very effective, but I do try to limit its use more and more, as it often doesn't feel as natural. After this main sound effect is finished, I start adding more background sound effects, like Charlie moving on the bed. For longer sound effects, like this bedsheet sound, I cut it off at quiet points to fit the length of a scene, and sometimes also add a fade out to smooth out the ending even more. Voices themselves are split between tracks voice 0 and voice 1, so you can differentiate between different characters speaking easily. What are you doing? In the example of Boy Band Crush, all of Charlie's voice lines are in voice 0 and all of Nick's voice lines are in voice 1. These two separate voice tracks are in addition also helpful for being able to overlap two voice recordings. Some more dynamic sound effects, like footsteps, also get changing volume and pan through keyframes so that they sound like they're moving through the scene. Like this example illustrates Nick walking into the scene from the right. Finally, I think of more interesting sound effects to add to a scene so that the scene gets more unique and doesn't sound like a scene you already heard multiple times. Here, I decided to add teacup sound effects. What are you doing? And in the end, I also add panning to the voices to match the scene, so Nick talks from the right and Charlie talks from the left. What are you doing? Nothing? The panning of voices is actually really important, since I don't read with different voices because I'm not talented enough for that. Panning can really help to still be able to differentiate all the characters, as this example clearly shows. Jimmy's definitely the hottest. No way! Rowan is my favorite. Jimmy's definitely the hottest. No way! Rowan is my favorite. However, overdoing it is also dangerous, which is why I often limit pan for voices at 10. After all the scenes are set up with sound effects, it's time to add some music to them. I do this after creating the scenes most of the time, and only for very special songs create the scenes around that song. For background OST, like in this example, I added after finishing the scenes and then cut the soundtrack to fit the scene itself. If I ever need to transition songs from the foreground to the background, or the other way around, I often blend them by having one fade out while the other one fades in simultaneously. Since both tracks are at the exact same moment of a song, just with different effects applied, this works perfectly. In this example, the song transitions to the background because the new track has an equalizer applied that cuts out most of the highs. This creates this feeling of hearing the song from a different room. And lastly, for cutting, I also need to indicate where to transition between my created panels, as all those will be animated in After Effects and not DaVinci Resolve. This is done by placing named markers at each point a new panel starts, and then exporting only the audio for each panel as a separate audio file. Now to the last step, animation. The first job on the table is pretty simple. Import all the necessary assets, audio and the Photoshop file, into an After Effects project. After that, I need to combine the audio and all the Photoshop layers into a single composition and adjust the clip length of all the layers to fit the length of the audio file. Now it's time for the actual animation. First, I need to show one panel after another, by changing the layer length and potentially animating the opacity for a smooth fade-in effect. After that, I can animate all the speech bubbles that were separated from their original panels. Here, in addition to opacity, sometimes these also have their position animated and motion blur applied. Hi! Now I can also animate all the visual sound effects. Because all the layers are combined in one group, I can animate them separate from the panel in their own composition. In this example, I animate the position and opacity of Nick's idea to appear and then fade away again. Of course, the cutout decorations also need to be animated. They can be animated in a similar way to visual sound effects, as they are contained in their own group as well. These flowers, for example, need to be animated in position and rotation. Hi! Lastly, I would also animate the opacity of paint if the panel requires it. Some panels also have additional work tied to them, as they need to display parts of the previous panel that then fades out to help with transitioning from one panel to the next. As the very last point, we now need to place the from After Effects exported animated panels at the right position in the timeline again, which fortunately is already indicated by the markers we previously added. And finally, we can start the final export of the video itself. And there it is, the final result. Of course, every YouTuber knows that it doesn't end there. We of course also need a thumbnail, we need to write the description, and then upload everything to YouTube. The thumbnails for mini-comics are more unique than for the main chapters, so doing those also takes additional time, as you can see right now. The description is fortunately done quite easily, as most of it is pretty similar between all videos. So I simply used the blueprint and changed some aspects to fit the new mini-comic. The last aspect I wanted to touch on is, well, how long did all of this take in the end? Because I had never measured the time all this takes in such detail. So, voice recording and cutting those voice lines took me 40 minutes and 19 seconds. Drawing the panels alone took me 3 hours, 29 minutes and 42 seconds. Cutting all the audio then took an additional 1 hour, 39 minutes and 41 seconds. And finally animating all the panels took an additional 2 hours, 1 minute and 56 seconds. First realization, the video part, so drawing and animating, takes double the time than the actual audio part, so voice recording and cutting, which makes the name audio comic somewhat misleading, to be honest. Adding everything together, I ended up working about 8.5 hours on this 3-minute mini-comic, which raises an interesting question. Given this data, how long would a complete chapter take? Let's use the next chapter 4 as an example, as this will be my next big project. Here are all the times I need for the individual steps for this chapter. Everything combined, with a simple extrapolation, I need about 248 hours and 32 minutes of total work on chapter 4 before I can finally upload it, so yeah. Even from now on, it will still take a while. And that's it. That's how an audio comic is made. As already said, the big chapters aren't any different, but I do work on them in parts, so to not have 111 hours of drawing before I can move on to the next step. Thanks so much for your continued support. I hope maybe someone even learned a few interesting facts or tricks from this video. Of course, it was not a very deep explanation of everything, as that video would have been a lot bigger, probably too big. If you still have questions about specific aspects of my workflow, you can of course always ask in the comments, and I'm more than happy to answer. But now, I think I need to get back to working on chapter 4, or I will never finish. Bye.